Hello, shalom, salam. My name is Zuri, and I am a associated with the project of the proto-socialism uh, concept of the Bea Abidan, which is a project designated for people like me or other people that would be of Christian, Muslim, Mormon, etc. As long as the religious affiliations have Jesus as a Messiah, messianic figure, right? eh, to bring them back into a understanding of what the simplicity of the seven Noahide laws or the Rainbow Covenant is. So in this one, I've been doing a series of religious affiliation within the Latino and Hispanic community. This is by far, this would be one of the largest attempts from memory because while there is a lot in Judaism and the indigenous ones, this is by logic, we can conclude that because every most likely you've met a Hispanic or Latino that has been Catholic or some sort of Christian, right? So in the sense, this is would be very extended. I would briefly touch in different theological concepts because the history actually starts in Jerusalem. But if we're going to start with history, right, or with pseudo history, or with church history, right? It would vary as to the interpretation of it. So here we go. It's a little bit of history. I'm going to touch a little bit in so many years, uh, but we start with the traditional concept in Catholicism of why uh, the that the apostle Peter was given the keys to heaven, right? So this is the majority are Catholics. You'll Catholic audience understands that this is the concept of apostolic succession, which Judaism and Islam have a similar concept called the Shalshelet or Silsila. So this succession is like a student teacher succession or a holy succession, you can kind of argue, of who is in charge of the community at certain points of time. And when there's these communities that are formed, um, a lot of the theological heavyweights of the Hispanic and Latino communities, right? Because I'm gonna include not only the Hispanic but also Lusophone and Francophone and Italians here in this for a brief moment. Is a lot of the works, particularly of Tertullian, are heavily used by both the Catholics and Pentecostals, or heavily influenced by him, thanks to both communities having a significant approach of Pentecostals or charismatics, right? It would be incorrect to say that there's Pentecostals, but there's charismatic Catholics in there, which, in a short summary, explaining them, they're Pentecostal Catholics. It would be it's a huge underestimation calling them that because they're still Catholics, but they are more. That's the simplest way. And since Catholics heavily focus on what natural law is, and by extension, the Protestants of the Latin-speaking community, they they would focus heavily on natural theology and natural law. So heavily. influenced by Saint Saint Thomas Aquinas, who, if I remember, he's a German-based uh, person, right? So I've already explained a little bit of the theology behind it, but it does not interpret the politics that has crept into today, and that would actually require the church history of every individual church, because as in every church, there's so much to cover. So we've crept in there for a bit. Now, with the theological components of what natural theology is in a short concept, is everything has order within it, and you have to explain why the order is. But besides that, the order is simply given because of God. So this is the simplest explanation I can give with natural theology. Um, Now that we have the basis, because the two largest communities today for the Hispanic and Latinos, and the rest of the world would be Catholics and Pentecostals, of independent varieties of the multiple Pentecostal or charismatic or Wesleyan derived denominations that are in communion or may not be in communion with each other. So that's a little bit of the historical and theological impact. Now, so like I said, I'm gonna involve a lot of the French and Italian thinkers here for history, and because I'm not gonna go through the ancient history because it's actually heavily tied with the papal states, and it's so much history that I just can't bring myself to describe it. Because someone's gonna say, "Oh no, there's a papacy, it's in Avignon, then there's the anti-pope somewhere else." So, and that would actually just require a different expertise of history that I don't have the patience for, personally. But let's start with the Protestant Reformation and the divergence of the first, uh, what do you call it, Pentecostal uh, Latin-derived peoples. So, with the first Latin-derived Pentecostals, it starts in France, heavily based with the Presbyterian movement of John Calvin, and these communities become the Huguenots, right? The Huguenots are successful in their, well, establishment of their own communities. Well, relatively successful until, well, the French nobility is like, we got to do something about them. And when these Huguenot revolts start, they run to different parts of Europe. When they're running to the different parts of Europe, they influence places like Switzerland, Italy, and well, besides Italy, um, other communities. Mind you, during the Protestant Reformation is a whole mess of people just being theological diverse, exploring different ideas. So I am not familiar with what the Eastern Latin peoples, like the Romanians and what would later become the Moldovans or the Dalmatians, would have experienced. But let's 100% bet that they were influenced by the Moravians and by John Hus from one concept or another. Now going back to Western Europe, because it's more of where we're focusing, par- particularly the Iberian Peninsula. That I completely forgot the name of the guy that is a the founder of the Jesuit order, but the Jesuit order is one of the few unique orders today that is known for its vows of poverty and its deep theological pursuits. And if I remember, they're what do you call? Well, they're the ones that live in society here and there. Uh, um, so or the Society of Jesus, as it's shortened to as is is that the Society of Jesus was made as a counter reform movement. It wasn't particularly made with the intention of counter reform, but with the intention of bringing back the Spanish reformers into Catholicism. But um, I did not extensively talk on the Spanish reformers because, well, their works wouldn't have exactly impacted during the era. Only the Italian reformers, sorry, the Spanish reformers that ended up going to northern Italy and later merged with with the remnants of the Moravian Church would have still survived. I completely forgot their names, but the greatest theological and historical works that they've left is because of the Sephardic community in Spain. They've it, essentially recreated a very, let me find the correct word for this, a very unbiased Bible that even other Christians would have used, and it updated the language from Latin into the Spanish of the era. So it just updates language based on Masoretic text, which those Masoretic texts, well, actually, it updates language based on the Judaismo, or rather Latino of the time, in which those texts are updated from the Masoretic text. Now, lately, there has been online a push against the Masoretic text. Let's be honest with the compilation of this, uh, what would later become La Reina Valera. It is what you call an eclectic composition of biblical work, and it's how many modern Bible translations are done. So they would have used every and any resource to figure out the translation process of the apostles or the writers, prophets, and scribes of the era, right? So they use a lot of Masoretic based, a lot of Judaism based. They also use the 70, the Septuaginta. So it is one of the first instances where they've used what would basically modern biblical scholars would use today of creating these modern Bibles. To be fair, the updated language of the sorry about that, but to be fair, the updated versions of these languages and these Valeras today are impacted by the modern liberal and conservative politics, and it's what make it a very biased translation for today. But the original versions or the original editions would would have tried to kept truth for it. Um, Now, I just sort of paraphrase that because I'm not gonna go through every single book and point out the well they should have translated this as like as Panarion or should have translated this other word as from the word of El Shaddai, etc., etc. Right? It's I'm not gonna nitpick it. So the impact is there today with the evangelical Latino community. I am hesitant of just calling them all evangelical because they are not all under the same camp of American evangelicalism. They're they are more traditionalist, uh, but let's go back. Let's fast forward a little bit of this time, right? So, as what we've talked before, right? The Catholic Church is all over Spain, and other the Spanish and Lusophonic colonies, and even the Catholic uh, French colonies. So you have the three important Latin-based colonies there: France, Portugal, and Spain, or the beginnings of what would become Spain. So their importance once they go there, right, is they're bringing a lot of different Catholic theology into the New World. But as I said before, in Mexico, Colombia, and in the Spanish world, and also in the Portuguese world, a lot of these former Sephardic converso families try to go so they could have like this syncretic form of Catholicism. It would be incorrect to call it syncretic. This updated form of their Catholic faith, heavily influenced by Hebraicisms, um, is going there. Some of them are actually trying to return to Judaism, and they end up in really weird frontiers of these colonies, such as in Texas, well, southern Texas, northern Mexico, or in the borders of the Colombian jungles, or in the Caribbean islands. Um, the same thing with the Quebecois. Um, I don't think they would have been the Sephardic community anymore, or the Ashkenazim of France, because they had different things going on in France. But what would have happened is this is speculation, but the Huguenots, or the remnants of the Huguenots, would have tried to run into places like Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Quebec, and what today would be the remnants of La Louisiane, so from Louisiana, Nouvelle-Orleans, let's say those states that became like Missouri, Mississippi. Um, if I remember, Michigan was part of it too. Um, Indiana was also there too. So these are what we call the French colonies. Haiti is there too, and a couple islands like Saint Pierre and Miquelon. While they're there conducting these important, well, while they're just well trying to survive. That's what they're trying to do, trying to survive. Um, the right, so the influx of I do not want to use this term, but illegal Anglo-American settlers into Texas and both legal Catholic Anglo-American settlers into Texas brought two different forms of Christianity back into Mexico. It brought a form of, I wouldn't want to call it the earliest form of Anglo Catholicism in the United States, but it is very much one of the earliest forms of Anglo Catholicism besides Maryland to have had survived or adapted prior to the modern Anglo Catholics of today. And when they're bringing all these different Protestant denominations up from Texas, particularly the more important ones in here would be the Baptist, the Presbyterians, and the Methodist. So these are the three important ones during the era. Uh, because Methodism would have been relatively new to the United States, but quietly influential because it this derived out of Anglicanism and Episcopalianism, but they're more focused on community building. After Methodism, like I said, it was the Presbyterians, which, if you've been long enough on the internet, there's been a lot of Presbyterians talking about it. Um, Particularly somebody called Reading Zoomer. Um, what else is there to convey with peace? So you have that being the beginning of a new community unfold back in what would be prior to the Mexican American War. So you have those three called Protestant denominations. Uh, there would be two more that I'm going to focus on a little bit later, but they're one is Restorationist, and the other one is what's called Pentecostalism. Because it's actually, I would just keep Pentecostalism with Methodism because it's under the same branch because they're focusing on becoming a better person. So, which would later develop into the doctrines of sanctification and baptism under fire. So this would also be important. These things would gradually develop, but it held Presbyterianism a bit. But the importance of Presbyterianism is when you have the first censuses conducted for the Tejano, Namajicanos, and California community that successfully, you, you could say, became Protestants, right? The These Protestant communities were traced to certain individuals, but let's be honest, nothing about religious history is uh, linear. Religious identity and belief is more like a spider web. So the, I'd argue that the Baptists would have been the first do or similar theologies would have appeared amongst individual converso families who would have eventually helped out because these converso families were being strategic, right? They either became or remained Catholic, returned to Judaism, or took the risk and helped the Protestant Spanish reformers, which some of them did, I just can't remember the names of everybody. Like I said, this is all on top of my head. Following uh, these these reforms, sorry, these changes, I felt the Baptist too. This is important because this is where you get the first mentions of the blood of trail theory by a Baptist minister in what would it be then the Republic of Texas. Um, I don't think this is or maybe the first time it gets written down and preached rather than properly to be hearsay, right? Because a lot of churches still teach this of different variations, right? To different intensities. Because to be fair, there is some merit to this theory. It is it is just that when we look at it, the book that this preacher does is doing it with a little bit of, hey, well, we're basically trying to run away from a different time and place, and so we the Baptists can properly practice. Or and you could argue, yeah, Baptist um, communities would have been a minority during this time. Today, there's like a majority with the Pentecostals here in what would be the southern United States. Following that, um, you also would get the emergence of the Restorationist movement. So you have would be the Seventh-day Adventists, the Mormons, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and after the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they have their splinter groups, and what would later influence the Jehovah's Witnesses. I would I would not want to put exactly the Seventh-day Adventist with the Restorationists, but their origin is Restorationist. Today, they're more in line with the evangelicals, like the Baptists and Pentecostals. The only difference that they do is they just go on church on Saturday. They have their own unique quirks, like being more vegan, vegetarian, and nutrition based uh, forms of, like, you could argue, castrates, their own unique dietary laws based on the Jewish dietary laws. Following that, today we have a lot of non-denominationals, which would carry a weaker theology than both Pentecostals and Baptists, but would be more affirming of everybody, and a lot of them have embraced this identity. I skipped a lot of it because it would be a 30-minute talk for now, and I also have to make. I would also want to share this in Spanish, but if I were to get into every significant detail, oof, um, I just covered the important details, an important part of the history. Unfortunately, I didn't give any dates because, like I said, it's on top of my head, just quickly, uh, because, well, I've been researching this to remember. Um, I want to keep it simple for certain audiences, but also a little bit to the point where they would think uh, beyond me just telling them everything. I'm gonna do the same thing in Spanish. So, but my name is Yuri, and thank y'all for listening.